Good to go. Okay. So I will be beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. To be a young trans girl in the heart of New York isn't easy, particularly because you have to watch old white straight men in front of you exploit your identity for political clout, but never at any point in time do anything for the people that live like you. On proposition, we mitigate this egregious exploitation. I'll contend on 2 key respects, one on the progression of politics, secondly on the siege, on scapegoating. But before we get into that, just a few characteristics or a few defining characteristics on setup. 1, we look at the problem that plagues us. We say we often have older individuals that exist in a different era, in a different social, bubble than our majority young populace. We say that this looks like Congress looking into Shu Chu, the CEO of TikTok, and failing to understand the nuance of privacy issues at that particular age. We think this looks like them having different established connections of people to caring about Apex sponsors more than they care about like the young people within that particular industry. But secondly, we say the scapegoating. We say that political parties avoid accountability to blame by blaming the senile-ness of their old political leaders. And we say this sells because the imagery of a senile man failing is easy to buy. We say that the general public looks for easy, palatable reasons to then associate that disappointment with. But lastly, we talk about the diminished capacity to be of like thinking of good politics in general. We say when you're older, you don't really think as well, right? We think that's something that is important. Secondly, we talk about the nature of politics. We say that politics is a top-heavy sport. It exists on the premises of established connection. We say that this means that if you meet the right people and you sleep in bed with them for long enough, we say this is how you get to the top positions anyway. We say you are likely to get there at any point in time. Biden started as a senator. We think at this point in time he's now a president, right? Naturally, then second, we say naturally the nature of sports is that it's an ideological narrative about the right people who run for office. We say that this even affects voters in themselves. This is to say the idea of being old enough and being very old is like directly proportional with your ability to exist within office. We say this narrative is what makes people very unconfident about voting for young people. But secondly, we say this is what makes young people themselves unconfident about putting themselves in office. Lastly, second of last, we talk about the gravity of politics. We say you need to understand that one vote can change the livelihoods of a lot of people. It is important that we determine who is in this office because this determines the abortion rights for women, who overturns Roe v. Wade and who doesn't, about the immigration laws that particularly people face and the struggles that they face within these things. We think politics is very important. But lastly, let's talk about the model. This is quite simple. We say by the time that the electoral process is over and you're 60, we cut you. There's nothing about it. We say age limits at the bottom remain at 25. At the bottom, we think that's okay. We say this limits the amount of time that you can use to make full use of the established political connections that you have. So we say that at the end of the day, we think we do not have people like Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe living for a long time and exploiting these political connections that they've garnered. We think that's important. I'll take your POI before I move on to the next argument.
Why did Biden withdraw from this year's election?
We don't think it was because he admitted that he was old and senile, so definitely just left. We think it was because of a series of pressures. We've seen old leaders that stay for long and longer years. Mugabe stayed until he was 90 and he died. We don't think that this is an issue about him accepting his senility as a man. But moving on, how do we then cater for the progression of politics in itself? We need to give you a premise here. 1, we say that the youth have been systemically disenfranchised from the political space, and this has been harmful to the engagement of their values in politics. Currently, the youth don't believe the system is penetrable because it's top heavy. We told you that if you don't have these connections, then there's nothing that you can actually do because it's difficult to penetrate. But secondly, we told you that there's a narrative around politics that it's heavy on how young people can't sit in office. And this often harms the chances of people being elected, even if they did want to move into this election. But even when they don't, right, what we say they do is that they opt into NGOs, etc., to try and exert influence from the outside. Listen here, we value the idea of people exerting influence from external pressures. We just think because of this, less youth are willing to engage in politics in itself and make a substantial change from the inside, right? But secondly, we say politicians aren't receptive to the youth cries from outside because they've got so many people whose like bread they have to butter before they start talking about the youth. They need to deal with a lot of the connections that they made in order to get to that point, in order to deal with it, right? But secondly, why then do we get the progression of politics on our side? 1, we say we cut off politicians with connections. This is valuable because we reduce the number of people that don't listen to your complaints because of the number of connections that they have have to satisfy first. But secondly, we say that these spaces become more penetrable. This is to say that at the point in time at which we know that above 60 no one is going to be able to run, it means that you know that there's going to be a vacuum, an open space for young people to enter within these political spaces. We say that is valuable in itself. Secondly, we say there's a signaling effect that politics becomes more malleable, right? We think because of that idea, we think outside activists are likely to lobby even harder and even more to institute change inside these political spaces. This is to say, because they realize about how politics is becoming more malleable because of the youthful people entering without these connections, we think they're going to be harsher in their forms of being able to institute change. We think this is something that's valuable. We access a critical mass here for two reasons. One, we say individuals that don't believe even in that politics that the people are lobbying for are vulnerable to being kicked out of office. So they're likely to be receptive to the people that voted them in the first place. They're likely to be receptive to the outside pressures because they don't have any connections to satisfy first immediately. But secondly, we say that there's a higher proportion of progressive politicians that are going to influx within the politics space. We think this is going to create a very huge amount of people that are going to manipulate that political space. What are the impacts here? One, we say we have better laws that are more supportive to minorities, which looks like gender-affirming care to trans individuals. This looks like reproductive rights to women. This looks like anti-discrimination laws being more robust for people of color. We say that we even get better military allocation of resources. This is to say, instead of spending all your billions on access to military budgets, at least we've got much more being put on economic and environmental policies, such as unemployment benefits for people or protecting the environment, instead of putting things like the Willow Project in Alaska, right? Secondly, we say that way this on its vulnerability. We say that we help the youth in poor circumstances. This is to say that the trans people that can't get the access to care that they need to live, the women who die because of lack of access to abortion, because of men that don't exist in those spaces and can't relate to that because they're old and senile and stay within those spaces for long, is something that gets to at least change for the better on our side. But secondly, weigh this on likelihood. We say it's likely on our side for us to get more receptive politics on our side, because particularly you get people that listen. You get people that are able to listen on their side compared to their side, where you've got a lot of people who are old and very established into these systems and are unwilling to change. The second argument that we have is to say that this policy places the burden of accountability on political parties. We say political parties have a tendency of separating or separating or distancing themselves from political figureheads in case of incompetence. We think this looks like it manifests itself in actively promoting Joe Biden for president and now trying to associate the failures of the administration with Biden's cognitive and physical disabilities. We think it's easy for people to then sympathize with the party, as the perception is the problem with this was for those particular figureheads, who are for the figureheads rather than the party itself. This then allows them to be very violent in the way in which they push harmful things like funding Israel, because they know that they're not going to attain the proportional blame, right? The proportional blame is likely going to go to those particular figureheads. This becomes very difficult for the people who determine the delta, because they don't understand whether it's a problem of politics or that political figurehead. We say hence there is no accountability. Why this is particularly true is because the people this policy affects is not necessarily crazy leftist debaters like us. We think it affects normal liberals that just look at Biden and think Biden is the one responsible for everything. And this is a very great group of people that are getting affected by this, right? So secondly, we say that there is a better idea of representatives and reprieve in itself. We think because when on our side, what we achieve is an ability to hold the accountability to the party, because we think the moment that they think this is a capable leader that everyone has been supporting, the narrative around it means that it's something that has been agreed upon by that entire party. We think the accountability mechanisms on our side are more robust, and we value that a lot. We never have ever been more proud to propose.
Though it may be imperfect at times, choice is a fundamental aspect of any true democratic system. When proposition looks to overly restrict this from voters, we think they delegitimize the democratic process and create worse governance for all. Two arguments in my speech today. First, on why we're better able to maximize democratic choice. Second, on why we improve the quality of governance. Before that, a couple points of setup. First, what do we support? We support the status quo, where there are no upper limits on the age that you can run for political office, which includes things like municipal office, like House or Congress, and the presidential office. Note, we could use the similar or less amounts of political capital that exists on their side to ensure that all candidates pass a mental cognition test and have the results be published publicly. Why do we think, though, there are natural incentives already to not elect people who are cognitively declined in the majority of cases? We think this debate exists across the entire world, across a range of different countries. Hence, in most cases, we think that cognitively old individuals tend to self-select out already because it often takes a lot of effort, in order for you to campaign. It often relies on you having a lot of charisma and coherency in order for you to platform your campaign. But B, even if you do campaign, we think that voters like candidates who are sprightly and lively because this pushes the image that you are capable. For instance, this is why JFK likely won over Nixon. Moreover, we think political parties also have an incentive to win, right? And in this case, they're likely going to push you out if they think you are not cognitively enabled enough. So for instance, Biden losing tons of Democratic donor support after his performance in the presidential debate and literally pulling out. Thus, we think the majority of candidates who will run will likely be competent. At 60, what do we think are your mental capabilities? We think that most people at 60 are still pretty competent. Most people still work. A lot of our judges here are over 60. So we think that this is a very low upper limit. Before getting to constructive, a couple of responses. The biggest flaw on their side was never actually proving the link between age and good policy. Let's look at what actually influences politicians' behavior. First, we think their primary incentive is to be re-elected. To do this, they need to cater to voters who could potentially vote for them or who are potentially swing voters. So for instance, the gay constituency is a huge constituency that could possibly come out and vote for you, right? For instance, the Turkish people in Germany are a swing vote between the SPD and the CDU. So in this case, in these cases, you're likely going to want to pander to, for instance, the gay people they want to protect because you want them to come out and vote for you. So we don't think that representation is dependent on age as they claim. Second, they say older people have more connections, but we would argue that lobbying only works if it helps you get re-elected. You're unlikely to push policies that would presumably not get you elected. It only works if you have that platform. So we think that given that there are things like campaign finance laws and lots of scrutiny, this is unlikely to be something that is a huge problem or something that they can solve, right? Lastly, they say that young people are inherently good. Sure, they can be good, but this is not always the case. What matters are their policies, right? They need to prove that this is inherent to age. Lastly, they say on scapegoating, in that you can blame the cognitive decline of Biden instead of the Democratic Party for pushing for Israel. I think that this is quite of a stretch, right? Biden was literally kicked off. You still have backlash against Israel. I don't think that there is a clear connection here. Before constructive, yes?
Are you willing to maintain the lower age limits to entry into politics?
This is not the debate, and usually lower age limits are either 18 for lower houses, but if you're talking about the presidential, this is only about the presidency. This is not the debate. This is about all political office. First argument, then, on why we maximize democratic choice. The value of democracy lies in the fact that voters are given a range of choices in candidates, so they can make the best approximation as to which candidate best fits into their values. In this argument, we will prove to you why when this choice is taken away from voters, the consent of the governed in a democratic system is eroded. First, what is the value of democratic choice? No one would believe it would be democratic to choose from a tiny set of similar options, where your range of opinions is less likely to be representative of your interests. This is because the state has huge control over your life, whether that be your earnings, when to put you in jail, where you're educated. Hence, we justify this by allowing people to choose such leaders. Of course, there are constraints on who ends up being on the ballot on either side of the house, but we are the side that gets to the closest practical approximation of this principle on our side. Why does proposition overly limit democratic choice? First, let's talk about capacity. We think that being 60 is a very, very low bar in most instances. So for instance, Modi is literally in his late 70s. Kamala Harris herself is 59, right? People over 60 in the country are probably about 20% of your population. So on their side of the house, they constrain huge amounts of the types of people who can run by a significant amount. And second, but this also deals with their mechanism on less people entering politics, right? We think actually on their side, less people are likely to run for democratic office. This is because the process of moving up the politics chain is often a very arduous one. Yet this sets a very stringent limit on where your journey ends. So we think the decision to enter politics often has costs, right? And most people often only enter it when you can get high rewards off it. So, most people going into politics in their early 30s or late 20s don't think that they'll achieve their goals right away. It often takes quite a lot of time. If you think and you know that there is a set limit, you're less likely to think that you can achieve your goals and hence may not make the decision to enter in the first place. The end point of this is that you get a far smaller pool of candidates that you can even pick from in the first place. That is far less democratic. Why is this important and an independent path to victory? First, let's talk about voters and consent. We think there are sufficient checks in place already that ensure people can approximately consent to this. First, you still need to win the primary and the municipal elections to be on the ballot. Second, you still need to win the general election and get people to vote for you. You need to cater to people's interests in order for you to do this. So, we think that there are sufficient checks already in place. Proposition overly corrects for this. Second, this is about the process of democracy. It doesn't matter if there are 1 or 2 cases where this can be good. It doesn't matter because of A, we think there are already natural incentives that have such people self-select already. But B, the process of potentially blocking representative candidates is a far worse precedent to set. So on our side, we extol more democratic principles. Second argument then, on why we improve the quality of governance. Politicians make decisions based on what is most likely to get them re-elected in the short, medium, and long term. In most circumstances, political incentives means that politicians balance all of these while crafting policy, creating a balance of long and short-term policy. This argument will prove why an upper age limit on politicians makes their incentives far more short-termist, leading to worse policy for the long term. What do we think are the incentives of politicians? Let's look at them during their office, right? You often want to be re-elected in the future and to advance your own political career. For many, being in politics is a long-term game. Many mayors want to become senators, who then want to become speakers of the houses and have aspirations of advancing their career, just like any other job sector. Thus, many politicians have hopes of continuing their political advancements even past age 60. But let's look at your exit options and what happens after politics. Depending on when you leave the political field, you will often either A, retire out of politics because you're old, or B, go into the private sector to make money. If you're young, right, you have a significant network of CEOs and regulations, given that this is very lucrative, you have a very specific skill set, this is why you often move into the private sector. What are the implications of this on prop? When you cut the political careers of many politicians short, this significantly changes their actions. First, let's talk about policy. You get far more short-term policies. This is because politicians have less ability to advance their political careers into the future. They look less at how their policies will impact their careers in the long term, 20 or 30 years down the line. If you care about the next 2 elections, not the potential election 10 to 20 years down. This is when you pass policies that benefit the economy now, but may harm it in the long term. So for instance, climate policies, mass spending right now at the expense of future debt, lower interest rates to curb on lower interest rates in the short term, but leading to very, very high inflation in the long term. On our side, politicians pass far more long-term policies. This is because it looks good on their CVs 10 years down the line when they try to advance their careers. They don't want to be blamed for being the ones who mess up the economy. But second, on the revolving door, this means you get more politicians who exit politics earlier and enter into the private sector. That is when you worsen the impacts of the revolving door significantly. For instance, how Macron's chief of staff, Ismail Emilian, currently works at Total Energy after moving out of politics. This happens to a far lesser extent and degree on our side when politicians are less likely to leave early. We ensure democracy is better protected.
Right, can the panel confirm that you can hear me? Right. I'll be starting my speech in the verse count of 3, 2, 1. Chair, there are 3 things that you get in the speech. Firstly, direct responses to what the first speaker gave us. Secondly, case rebuilding from side proposition and show you why we already win this debate based on the strategic flaws the first speaker just made. So firstly, what's the major strategic flaw that you think they make within their speech? Firstly, it's on the idea about political short-termism, right? We think there's a slippery slope to this argument. Why? Because we think that they don't allow candidates to run for even more than 2 terms in most instances. So we think even if these individuals are in government, they most likely even focus on the short-term benefits that they acquire within such political office, right? We think there's a slippery slope that if they believe that politics can only focus on long-term goals, if you allow people to stay within politics for longer, then we think that they will also be willing to extend the political terms to something like 10 years within each political term. We think that this is something that's particularly unfair because we think that leads to individuals not having a variety of policies in existence. But secondly, we say that the short term matters in terms of like how the long term is supposed to manifest, because individuals can desensitize accountability for not solving problems that are plaguing people right now and simply say that, you know what, we'll solve these issues within 2030. We think this is the same thing that has been happening even within developing countries, where you have governments that tell people about Vision 2030 when it's the year 2018, right? We think that long-termism takes away that sense of urgency from politics, which you think is required for governments to solve the problems that are actively plaguing people in most instances. We think this is something that's important. But thirdly, we say that the short term matters in order for the long term to even matter. We say that if you don't have good economic policies today, there's no way that good economic policies will manifest later in the future. We think this is something that doesn't happen, right? We think if you can't enact good political and economic policies for businesses to function in current status quo as a politician, it is highly unlikely that you are ever going to have that long-term benefit in and of itself, because those businesses don't even trust that economic environment because of how it looks like within that short term, right? But thirdly, we say that individuals don't even vote based on long term, right? We say that they vote based on the issues that are immediate to them. So we think that there's still like that immediate sense that you get from politicians, even if they are not in existence within politics for a particular long time, because we think that the demographic that they're catering to is still concerned about those immediate benefits that they want to claim on their side. But then what's the second strategic flaw that they make? Firstly, it's on the idea of the legitimacy of this policy to begin with. They tell us about the democratic principle. We ask them in a pure eye about why they're still willing to limit individuals in most instances that are not above the age of 40 to run for presidential office, because we still think that those individuals themselves can still opt into presidential office and lead to the variety that they talk about, right? We think this is an implicit concession on their side that there's a level of like legitimacy to a policy that limits the pool of individuals that you can do this. But secondly, we say that there's already a precedence to this. We don't allow criminals to run for political office, not because we don't think that those individuals can enact good policies in and of themselves, but because we think that the risk is too big to take care of, right? My first speaker tells you about how politics is able to affect the lives of individuals that we simply cannot risk it affecting those individuals. If you don't trust a person who's over 65 to drive in public transport, why would you trust an individual who is above 65 to be a president within your country? We say that this precedence is even set within individuals that work within public sector that looks after people, and we think this is a precedence that you need to set, because we think that if the risk exists, we are not willing to take that risk because of the inherent harms that come from it. But then what you get in terms of like pragmatics on side proposition, that is not sufficiently engaged by side opposition. Firstly, they tell us that, you know what, we want to have cognitive tests in instances where individuals are not cognitively like capable to run for office. What's the slippery slope of this argument? First, we say that there's no determining how your wellness is going to deteriorate in the future if you run for office. This is to say that if you are over 65 and just do a president, right, we think that your cognitive capabilities can deteriorate anytime, and we think this becomes a problem. Why? Because we think that those political people that exist within those positions are likely to continue to recycle those same cognitive results as a way to push their legitimacy within government office. But second, we have seen people call for Biden to take a cognitive test for over 4 years during his term, but that hasn't happened, right? We say that this takes even longer for those individuals to get out of office when they enter with cognitive issues, right? We think this is an inherent harm that exists exclusively on side opposition within this space, because we think we can't afford to continue having to push for individuals to go and get tested for their cognitive capabilities. But we think that in that same period where Biden was being pushed to take those cognitive tests was the same time that was making very bad policies for America that wasn't really working for the entire country. We say America has had surges of inflation. They've ruined foreign policy by funding states like Israel. They have worsened tension in the East by causing Russia-Ukraine war. We think those are all policies that particularly exist when you have somebody who has been perceived as incapable running that particular office, right? We think these are benefits that are able to be claimed exclusively from side proposition. Why? Because we say that it's oftentimes impossible to determine the cognitive capability of that individual in the future. This is to say that if you test the cognitive capability of that person today, it's unable to determine how it's going to look like in the future, and we think this is something that they needed to consider. But second, we say that even continuous cognitive tests aren't going to work. Why? Because we think that individuals constantly have to continue to take them, and it's easy for these individuals to even fabricate those results to begin with. We think on our side, individuals can't fabricate how old they are, and we think we can actively tell you that you've been running for political office for over 40 years, there's no way you are below the age of 60. Right? We think this is something that can actually be claimed exclusively from side opposition within this state. Before I continue, I'll take one.
If you're perceived as old and literally incoherent, why do voters still vote for you?
We already told you that the sphere of politics in our first speech is based around connections. That if you are a young individual, you are unlikely to get promoted within those political spheres, because we think that the way individuals are marketed to the general public are marketed by those individuals that have connections. This is to say that if you can't vote for a person that looks like Biden, right, it means that you are the Democratic Party is likely to promote a younger individual as the face of the Democratic Party. We think the reason why individuals even voted between Trump and Biden is not because they believe that people that are of that age are particularly capable, but because they have no alternatives outside of that, right? We think they vote because of the opportunity cost that comes from such decisions, not because they believe so. But secondly, we say that even this decision is something that is marketed to you, right? We think that the way that that the voter consent itself works is not because voters are somewhat mostly informed about the decisions and the character of these individuals, but rather about how those individuals are particularly marketed to you. If the Democratic Party could market somebody who has proved to have cognitive issues like Biden and get a voting base, we think the same is likely to happen on your side when you don't limit these individuals that have cognitive issues from running for office. But then what's the exclusive matter that you get from side proposition that doesn't get engaging? Firstly, it's on the idea of responsiveness to political issues. These individuals stay in government for extensive periods of time. This looks like how Biden has been in government for over 40 years, and how a lot of the marketing that exists within the Democratic Party itself is likely to promote someone like Biden as opposed to a new bystander. What our policy does, therefore, is that it pushes these individuals out of those political spaces, and we think that vacuum itself allows individuals to opt into politics, right? This is something that opposition can't claim in this debate, because when you still have those people in government, it's unlikely that you create space for those individuals. They oftentimes wait for them to die or to be called out like Biden proud.
want to test, because this room is really echoey. If I speak at this volume and at this pace, am I clearly audible? Yeah. Okay, great. Their case exists in one country, and even within the country of the US, one specific example of Joe Biden. So let's look at all the other political systems around the world. Most of them do not have an abundance of individuals over 60 who are running. Most MPs, for instance, in the United Kingdom, often like age 20 or 30, they're not as old as they claim it out to be. And even the leaders of these places, Keir Starmer, for instance, is relatively young. Emmanuel Macron, for instance, is relatively young. And even the ones who are quote-unquote older are still very cognitively functional. Your Modis, for instance, your Angela Merkels, for instance, they're all very cognitively functional, even if they're over the age of 60, for instance. Therefore, their side really needed to identify where there was a really big problem in the status quo. Our claim is that the problem is not that big, it is not that extreme, and therefore the extreme stance they take of limiting everyone who is over the age of 60 from running from office is too extreme and does not fulfill the democratic principle that we outlined to you in first. They did not respond to that, and that takes down their principle or responses to our case. Given this said, I want to do two things in my speech. Number one, I want to once again prove to you why the democratic principle is the most important thing in this round, which will flip all their positive case. Secondly, I want to prove to you that even on their grounds, why we have better quality of governance, which means we actually conclusively take the practical claim as well. But before that, sure.
How do you extend the democratic principle when the number of individuals that are above that age are just a minuscule population?
They're not. There are 20% of the population who is over the age of 60. And just think about it, right? Most individuals now die at the age of 80 plus. So the gap there is just huge, right? There are like tens of millions in the US, for instance, who are over the age of 60. This is a lot of people. Okay, on the principle then. The biggest claim they have is, if the democratic principle is important, why are there other limits on who can run? I just want to note, the democratic principle is not absolute, and our argument is that there is a very high bar for limiting who can run. For instance, on their examples, on the 18-year-olds who aren't able to run for office, for instance, that is because an 18-year-old isn't fully cognitively developed, and you don't stop until the age of 25, for instance. But on their biggest example, which is the 40-year-old who can't, for running for presidency, this is one exceptional position, the most important position in the world, the President of the United States, where it is probably justified to ban it in the first place. So in these cases, the ones specifically that are in the status quo are justified. What isn't then is their stance that all political office, not just the presidency, but the people in the lower houses, the upper houses, literally every political office that you could run for is banned. And it's not also for most people who are cognitively declined, but most individuals from 60 to 70 who just aren't cognitively declined, and scientifically they're just still as mentally capable. Therefore, they have a really extreme ban. Our case is that this is not justified in this case, and our democratic principle that Rachel gave is still relevant here. But then they have two more responses. The first thing they say is, look, cognitive decline at age 60 probably happens, or if they enter office afterwards, then the decline will happen later. I have two things here. Number one, this is just, once again, a very extreme stance. I just really don't think people who are age 60 or even 65 or even 70 are mostly cognitively declined in most cases. But secondly, I just want to note, voters probably do consent in this case, that even if there are two relatively older candidates, or even one relatively older candidate versus a young candidate, if a sufficient amount of population turned out for them, i.e. 30 to 40% of the population, I think this is probably enough to outweigh the potential risk in the future of a slight risk of cognitive decline in the first place. Because as they note, this is very public information. If you decided to choose to vote for someone who is age 70, for instance, you probably consented to this risk in the first place. But the final claim and their best claim here is that you have no alternatives, that every candidate is old, and therefore you shouldn't be able to do this in the first place. This presumes that it is as bad as they say, that every candidate is old. But in my intro, I already told you why this isn't the case. Why you often do have sufficient alternatives, that most candidates who run for political office, like the MPs, for instance, are often relatively young. Therefore, there probably are sufficient alternatives in this case, and you don't have to run so in the first place. Our claim with that is that A, you do consent, that oftentimes this infringement is not sufficient on your consent, so the consent is most important here, and that even if you do end up voting for an old candidate who does cognitively decline in the first place, a sufficient amount of individuals voted for them, and so our principle still stands. But secondly, that fewer people can run, and there is a right for individuals to be able to change the policies in their country, a right for them to be able to run for office in the first place, and they take away the right for the 20% of individuals, and these are the ones who are most likely to run in the future, that if you're age 60 and you're retired from your job, you're most likely to want to go into politics in the first place. So you take away the right for the ones who are most likely to get into politics at older age, and you strip that right from them preemptively. Therefore, on the principle, we clearly win irrespective of outcomes, because, irrespective of outcomes. On the quality of governance then, I first want to make a very simple observation. Young does not mean progressive, and old does not mean conservative. For instance, the head of the AfD in Germany is relatively young. J.D. Vance, Trump's running mate, is relatively young. He's like 42. Bernie Sanders, for instance, the closest that the US has come to a really anti-establishment, really progressive politician is in his late 70s. This is because you do not set your agenda purely based on what you believe, or even what your age is. And there's this weird fallacy from them that young people are necessarily far more progressive on their side. I just want to flip their argument then. I want to actually give you neo-constructive material as to why older candidates are actually more likely to run on risky political agendas. I have two things here. Number one, younger politicians that plan on staying in politics have a long-term incentive to appease senior members of their party. This is because advancing further into politics is generally dependent on what senior members think of you, whether they think you're often reasonable, whether you're willing to abide for party lines, for instance. Thus, you like to actually conform with the majority. You take more risk-averse stances in most parties, because otherwise, you risk not being nominated for senior roles, you risk having funding being given to the other candidate in your primary, or in PR systems, not being in the party list in future elections, for instance. Why does this no longer apply when you're old? Two reasons. Number one, when you are in the twilight of your career, you don't have to worry about in the future. If you're Bernie Sanders, you want to retire outdoors, so you don't care what the Democratic Party thinks of you, for instance. But two, you're the most senior member in the party in the first place. That you're the one who is the entrenched senator. You're the one who has lots of allies and power in the party. Therefore, this actually frees you up and allows you to go for more risky stances, the more anti-establishment stances, the more risky stances that you otherwise wouldn't take on their side, or you merely stick to the party line that they say. Therefore, if no one can say no to you, that you're Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, with relatively old candidates who actually run on really progressive platforms, it's far more likely on our side. But secondly, I want to make tackle what happens when you actually move out. Because their response might be, oh, but when you're 58, you also move out eventually, so it's symmetric. No, the difference is, when you are 60, you likely will continue working. Most individuals who are in positions of power, your career politicians, tend to work till their 70s or 80s because they think they're very competent and they want to make money. When you're 75, though, on our side, you naturally age out and retire on our side, so the incentive to actually continue the long term is not symmetric. What are then your exit options as a 59-year-old politician on their side of the house? Two things. Number one, as Rachel notes, you have appointed positions in the political party's ministries. And once again, this falls back to my first incentive of impressing the party seniors and not aging out the individuals. Therefore, on their side of the house, you're still likely to actually stick to the party line because you want to get appointed to a ministry position in the future. You want to actually be in the senior party when you're 59, for instance. But secondly, and more importantly, Rachel also told you that it is the private sector. This deals with their argument on external influence. Basically, you want to exit as a consultant or an advisor to a large company, or even another organization external to politics. This means you're actually more susceptible to lobbying and external influence, and you're more likely to actually buy into these narratives that you actually take more money from corporate sources, even if you do declare it. That's your only exit option as you're older. Therefore, you're still more risk-averse on their side. We avoid this by actually having individuals who are less risk-averse on our side. But finally, even if both young and old, young-oriented people run for office, ours is better. Because as they note, old people have more connections, more people listen to them. This means if you run a more progressive platform on our side, you're more likely to be listened to. I just want to deal with the rest of their claims then. They say, I have lost my paper, sorry. They give you two claims. The first thing they give you is the idea that you are likely to leave out two groups. Number one, poor people. Look, working class people are incredibly important to the electorate. They are often 30% of the individuals in London, for instance, and therefore you just want to appeal to them on both sides of the house. Therefore, I think the incentive is symmetric and you apply to them anyway. But secondly, the trans girl in New York City. Look, the unfortunate reality is they are a very small voter base. They are not a swing voter in any way, so even if you're a young politician, you do not want to appeal to them in the first place. This is probably broadly symmetric, but I already flipped this earlier. But finally then, they say this is not on accountability, and you don't want to hold the entire party accountable because you just hold the senile politician instead. This is just empirically not true. When AOC voted abstain with the Iron Dome, there was lots of backlash. This is because she claimed to have a progressive agenda, but was still conservative anyway. Therefore, there's still going to be lots of scrutiny on individual politicians on our side. Now, when someone else makes a mistake, you don't just blame the president, you blame the other people who did make the mistake. Therefore, we still hold individuals accountable on our side. But then it's remaining on our side is as follows. One, when people run for office, they're more likely to be capable and run good policies. Two, you actually have better policies on our side if you're old than if you're young, and you just have best of both worlds on our side. And finally, even if that is true, we conclusively win in the principle that you did consent to this leader, and therefore you should not have this policy on their side.
Okay. May I please confirm that I'm audible if I speak like this? Okay. I will begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. When I was 11, the elections were being held in Zimbabwe. I was still pure, naive, and innocent, so I asked my parents who they were going to vote for. They said it didn't matter because they already knew who was going to win. At a point in time when both 65-year-old parents and 15-year-old kids both feel disenfranchised from the political system, something is clearly wrong. On prop, we fix the problem. On op, they ignore it. We are proud. Two things in this speech. First, a few strategic contentions as to why they overall lose this debate, like from the onset. But secondly, I'm going to go into clash matter, even if we take them at their best. Three things on strategy. One, on the overall contention about the age limit, basically saying that like people who are 60 years and above can still do really nice things and they're still able to make good policies. But people who are under 18, because their brains haven't developed, they aren't able to make these policies. Within this in of itself is an implicit concession that you can limit who is able to run into office based on cognitive ability. If you're at the risk of getting dementia, if you're at risk of being too old to make sufficient policies, that is something which is valid and allows for you to be limited in this sense. We say that even if not every single 65-year-old can't make policies, in the same way that not every single 18-year-old is not fully developed, we still don't allow either of them. We think that the contention about this low age limit was kind of something which was quite poor and was trying to scroll the motion. Secondly, on like the whole idea that people aren't going to vote for old people anyway, one, this is empirically untrue. We have politicians who are old in every country. In Africa, we have people like Jacob Zuma, Emerson Mnangagwa, Robert Mugabe, Joe Biden, Donald Trump. It's even like if they can pick examples of young people running office, we think that is the minority of cases. Even if it's not the minority of cases, the most vulnerable places are the ones where these old people are creating this harm, so we still ought to value them more. Finally, we think they just ignore our framing of how the political sphere looks. We think that we told you in first that the political sphere is restrictive. The longer you're able to be within the system, that is how you're able to create connections. When you create connections, you will never leave. Our contention in this debate was not only on the fact that being old is like bad, we tell you that being able to be in the system for long and being able to not be able to be displaced because you already have that entrenched power is something which we regret. We're the only side which stopped that from happening. Before I move on, any points?
But surely your idea that people who are in the political system for longer has an advantage also applies in your case. And the 50-year-old also has an inherent advantage over the 25-year-old.
Okay, but like the thing is, at the end of the day, eventually these 50-year-olds are going to have to leave. But secondly, on your side of the house, these individuals are able to stay forever and ever and ever. Even if they don't stay, they're able to help individuals who who have their same political views to continue to stay within that system. That is something which you don't get on our side of the house. We think that eventually is going to be a vacuum which allows for young people to penetrate the system. Three clashes in this debate. Firstly, on the clash which is the most important in this debate, which is the progression of politics, helping the minorities. We think I'm going to prove this to you later. What have we told you since first? One, that the youth feels disenfranchised with political systems. This is because it is very obvious and apparent that individuals who are old and individuals who have connections are the ones who keep the system. This looks like individuals who are friends with each other, individuals who have control over media spaces and can influence who individuals are going to vote for. That is the connections we've been talking to you about for this entire time. This has two implications. One, individuals feel as if it is very difficult for them to get into this political sphere. So instead of trying to get into politics, instead what they're going to do, instead of trying to get into politics, they're going to go out and function from an outside sphere. Instead of trying to lobby for the US government to stop funding Israel, we're going to see projects like Operation Olive Branch. We like that on both sides of the house. We still don't think that it's valuable, but we still think that exclusively we're able to see individuals actively trying to get the USA to stop funding Israel. That is something which is exclusive on our side of the house. But secondly, we try that there's a very little, if not no incentive to lobby when you know that the individuals who are in office are individuals who don't care about your opinion because they will never get out, because at the end of the day, they have connections. They're able to practically pick and choose who gets into this office and who stays in this office. So there's no incentive to lobby on this side of the house. We change that. One, we make sure that there's more availability of office. Individuals who are younger are able to get into the sphere, and that then allows for them to be able to actually affect the policies that they get there. But two, individuals who are already in office lose their connections because they aren't able to just stay with these same old people who they've been with for 40 years, from being a senator to being a congressman to being a president. Because these systems of power are broken down, we are exclusively able to make individuals more likely to change their mind. What is the implication of this? We are the only side which is able to get the critical mass which is required for us to get progressive politics. Even if they can nebulously prove that there is a representative minority, like in Turkey there's gay people who want to have rights, they don't actually prove to us why they didn't get the critical mass, which means that government is actively going to listen to these people. You only get that on our side of the the House, what are the implications of this? We are able to get rights for the trans people, rights for the black people, rights for the women. These are the individuals who are the most important. How do you weigh this clash? You weigh this clash on a few things. One, on vulnerability. We thought that the individuals who are in the minority are the most vulnerable people. We thought that when these individuals are not catered for, it is so horrible. We think on this side of the House, these individuals are never going to get catered for. But secondly, we think that the young people in this state who have been systematically disenfranchised from the political system are furthermore the individuals who ought to be valued the most because they have no bearing within the system. We think we ought to allow them to have the chance. Secondly, we weigh this on likelihood. Even if there is a chance of them getting progressive politics on this side of the House, we think it is more likely on our side of the House. So we think it is empirically better for us to get this progressive politics because it is something which helps these minorities. But finally, we weigh it on scale of impact. They made the push in this debate that individuals lose choice. I honestly don't understand why this is so important when they already can see that government doesn't let you vote for criminals, doesn't let you vote for 18-year-olds. So if individuals marginally lose a little bit of choice, we think it has a much less impact than trans people actively being denied the right to live, the right to be who they want to be. We think they had to contend with that. They had to actually weigh these impacts out. Second question in this debate, and they made the contention here on the democratic principle or the right to choice. What do we get from them? Tell us that like the limiting of the age is something which is so bad and it's against democracy because people aren't able to vote for who they want to. What are the major flaws of this argument? One, we thought that the principle is inherently flawed when they concede to the fact that 18-year-olds should not run for government. Therefore, like, even if a 12-year-old has 150 IQ, they can't run. So then the individuals still lose choice on either side of the House, so at best it is a wash. Secondly, we already proved that this is a principle which can be limited. In their second speech, they can see this is not an absolute principle. I don't understand why they want us to value a non-absolute principle to this extent. We thought that at a point in time, which we've been able to prove that the removal of the addition of this age cap is going to have positive practical impacts, as we have said, in the same way that this lower limit age cap of 18-year-olds also has these same positive impacts. This then negates the principle because the principle is only contingent on the fact that this democratic process is then going to help represent the people. At a point in time which people aren't happy on this side of the House, we don't think we even value this choice. So then that was a major issue there. But thirdly, even if they do win on this clash, it is such a marginal win panel. Like, yes, maybe 20 million people above the age of 60. There's probably 50 million people who are below the age of 60, because that's how policy, that's just how the world structure balances. There are always going to be more young people than old people. So the choice that they get is marginally more. But we think that on our side of the House, individuals who are young are systematically disenfranchised from the system. They don't even run for politics on our side, on their side of the House. So basically, individuals get that less choice on either side of the House. We think that is extremely important. You ought to value the first clash over the second. Final closing remarks on this extraneous clash about the idea of accountability in politics. What did we tell? We told that individuals distanced from the political parties. When the individuals are being funded in Gaza, we say that the Democratic Party says, no, it was Biden who was doing that, not me. So fair and fine. As they said, Biden gets held accountable, but the individuals who are really pulling the strings behind them, which is very unlikely to have been Biden, don't get held accountable. The only response here is that people really do get held accountable, but as they've literally told us, Biden is the one who stopped running for the election, even though it was the decision of the entire Democratic Party to put this policy into place. We think that is what scapegoating is. We think that it is bad. On side opposition, we protect the minorities, we protect the valuable choice. We are the winning side. We are proud.
Can I speak at this volume? Is it too echoey? Sorry? Okay. At the top, I'm going to settle this dispute about the principle, because this principle was never absolutist. It was a recognition that in a democracy, choice is important, so that as far as possible, we ought to be able to facilitate it. The reason why we limit people below the age of 18 from running for office is because empirically, it is certain that their brains have not developed yet. That is a fact. No amount of proposition wishy-washy analysis can actually disprove this biological fact. However, above the age of 60, there's a wide spectrum of cases. Yes, some people above the age of 60 will become cognitively declined. Many people will not be. Insofar as the threshold of cognitive decline has not been definitively proven, it is on the idea of we ought to facilitate choice as much as possible. We ought not to bar this significant constituency from being able to run for office, be able to exercise their fundamental right. But finally, note how we already dealt with this on our side of the House. It was that people who are severely cognitively declined are unlikely to run or hold office anyway. The natural electoral incentives of voters to want to vote in a politician who is good will naturally filter out these worst cases on our side of the House. Propositions model is one way to bar them. It is not the only way to bar them, and it is in fact an overly harsh way to do this. With that, their main contention on the principle is out of the realm. The second thing I'm going to flag to you is about our arguments on the quality of governance, and note how important this was. If we are able to prove that regardless of whether older people are disproportionately represented in democracy or not, if we prove to you on their side of the House that the quality of governance and the policies that they pass get fundamentally far, far worse, that their incentives are far, far worse, then governments do not do the thing that they want them to do. Governments are no longer likely to protect people on the ground. What did we tell you? We told you first, politicians will become more short-termist when they recognize that their future career in politics is cut short. That is to say that when you are a 20-something or 30-something working as a representative, that if you recognize that your future is unlikely to manifest, you're more likely to do things like push for overspending now or deprioritize climate change. Their only response to this were misunderstandings. This is not about one presidential term or two presidential terms. This was about your long-term political career as an individual. The second response they have is that you actually need the short term to have the long term. This presumes that there's no trade-off between the short term and the long term. Obviously there is. Taking out too much debt right now means your country suffers from debt crises in the future. But that is precisely what short-termist politicians are likely to push for, because they want to satisfy their constituency now and they want to get re-elected now. The problem is that this means that you come at a long-term cost, because you no longer care about what the country or what your party is going to be like after you turn 60, insofar as you can no longer be in politics. But the second impact we brought to you is that regulators and politicians are more likely to exit into the private sector at the age of 60. This is because many people at the age of 60 still want to work. This means that if you can no longer work in politics, your most lucrative option then is moving to the private sector. This is bad for your incentives because it means that under the revolving door, you push for weaker regulations. They had no response to this. The impacts of this should not be understated. This is about policy for everyone, about the economic conditions, for the very minorities and women that they care about. It's about the strength to push for climate policies, strength to reduce debt in exchange for higher interest rates now. This is independently round-winning. We've proven to you that governments on their side of the House is far more likely to have short-term incentives, and this is really, really bad. Before I move on to rebuttal, give it the line.
What is the value of choice if one, people do not feel represented in their vote, but two, individuals don't have an incentive to run because they feel that the system is too restrictive?
I'll respond to that now. Their argument, disproportionate representation of older people. They had three broad mechanisms, and I'll rebut to each of them in turn. Firstly, that older people are in a different bubble and thus do not understand young people. I want to note, as Nicole already flagged you, the representation of ages among candidates who run is not what explicitly matters in agenda setting. It is what they believe voters want. It is what is electorally determinative, what is widely discussed within society that affects agenda setting. Empirically, if you had too many old people only passing policies about pensions, for instance, then not many people would want to vote for these. Then proportionally, fewer people are going to vote for these people. That means you have to understand the interests of what your voters actually want. So if there is a significant constituency that cares about gay rights or trans healthcare, and note how these social issues are often electorally determinative because it is, because it is fundamental to their self-identity, then it can swing their vote one way or the other. But the more and more niche that this subset goes, then the less likely it is that you're going to get change on either side of the House. That means that things that are electorally determinative and important to young people are still going to be appealed to because they are a significant amount of the population. The second thing, and to the extent that older people do have an experiential gap with younger people vis-a-vis things like technology, they're obviously not the sole determiners. They work with things like technocrats or advisors or experts. The second mechanism they have is that young people select out of the presidency. First, I want to note, the strategic flaw here is that they take one position and extrapolate that to all public office positions. Obviously, there's more countries in this debate than just the US presidency. In many places, they have the parliamentary system. They have representatives, and the representatives' ages are likely to be far, far lower. In Hong Kong, for instance, the average age of our equivalent of representatives is around like 30. The reason for this is quite simple. It's because when you are relatively younger, you tend to be more motivated, you tend to be more optimistic, maybe you're fresh out of college, you want to change the world. But secondly, there are many districts that are largely constituted by younger liberals who are more likely to vote for younger people that represent their own district. That means there are many options available to younger people to hold public office. These just tend to be the more representative, more on the municipal level or the representative level. As you then rise up the political sphere and as you age, then there tend to be increasing qualifications. This is not necessarily bad, because the amount of power that you're afforded at each step of the way increases, meaning that you are more likely to need to have qualifications or have an illustrious career. This is not a bad thing. This just means that we can get more and more qualified politicians. But this also does not specifically bar out younger politicians from becoming president. Look at Bukele, for example, in El Salvador, who's extremely, extremely young. But finally, Nicole Split actually flips all of their arguments about older people having to be more conservative, because she proved to you that older candidates are far less likely to be risk averse because they have credibility. You care less about what the senior party's leadership thinks, because you yourself are that senior party, you yourself are senior, or you plan to retire anyway. This means you are more able to think about radical change. You're more able to appeal to a smaller niche groups that the rest of your party might not care about. When you're younger, you're then more likely to conform to the status quo. This flips the incentives on their side of the house. The final mechanism they have under this is the idea that you have connections. Look, we do not deny that having connections or having a long and illustrious career will get you connections. This is never the point. The point was, first, it's unclear why this is going to be the tipping point. It is unclear why knowing one or two more people within the White House, for instance, is going to actually win you the presidency. Probably things like your charisma or your ability to do public speaking matter a lot more. But secondly, I would wager that these connections are to some degree earned. That the fact that when you work in politics over a long period of time, that you make friends, that you network with people, it's not unclear why this is unjust and why this is an illegitimate form of democracy. Contrast this then to the relatively young, for instance, RFK Jr., who is young but has lots of connections, largely based on who he is and familial connections, rather than actually working in the politics for a long, long period of time. But at the bottom, I also want to then flag the implications of Nicole's POI here. If their analysis holds true, that older people just have an advantage over younger people, all it proves is that there are some advantages. They never prove that the advantage was so severe that you have to cut it off, and if you cut it off at the threshold of 60 plus. Presumably, Kamala Harris is still going to have an advantage over politicians who are 30-something, so they never were able to fulfill democracy on their side of the house. What does this mean at the end of the day? It means that the representation of older people is not disproportionate, but even to the extent it is, this is a natural result of needing more qualifications to advance in your career. Finally, I'm going to flag this idea of a democratic choice. This idea of accountability. Because they drop this in a second and then they bring it back. I want to note again, it's unclear why this sense of accountability and being able to scapegoat is exclusive to you being 60 plus. Scapegoating and moving away from candidates who make bad decisions is just a common political tactic. They were never able to impact this, and they were never able to prove the core missing mechanism. At the end of the day, we not only fulfill democracy far more, because we're able to expand the choices of people who can run. We're able to have people feel represented, that 20% of the population feels like they can vote. But finally, that we get better governance on our side, because politicians are more likely to look to the long term, that they want to stay within politics for a long period of time, so they pass policies that benefit everyone on the ground.
Our paths to victory are clear. First, this policy unjustifiably restricts choice, both for the millions of individuals who would have voted for the other competent politicians, and for many politically engaged individuals who are of the age of 60 who want to run, for instance, their local mayor politician. Given that they did not prove the high bar of why you have to restrict choice in this instance and why this exists here, even at best, there's a small risk of individuals suddenly becoming cognitively incapable in this age. The consent of individuals voting for these other politicians outweighs the small likelihood of harm. 2, we are better able to get better policy on our side, that more people are likely to go into politics, that more people are willing to diverge from the risk-averse party line. Hence, irrespective of the principle, we win on the lots of individuals fulfilling the high role in politics. 2 questions in this speech. First, on which side is better able to forward inclusive policy. Second, on democratic choice. Let's talk about policy then. This is important because both sides obviously care about passing policy that actually helps people on the ground. But let's compare the pathways of the 2 sides. They say all politicians are likely to dominate the political sphere and there are no alternatives for people on the ground. Look, down the bench, both sides can play example tennis, but we gave you structural reasons why this wasn't the case. First, we told you tend to self-select out already because campaigning on political platforms often requires effort, often requires a lot of energy and the charisma in order to cater to people. Second, your party is unlikely to support you if you are perceived to be very, very old, like how Biden lost support after the presidential debate. We think that there are natural checks in place here, right? If they want to talk about vulnerable places that have old leaders for a very, very long time, I just want to question them on the democratic nature of those places in the first place, right? If Mugabe was really in power for that long, or if there are other places that they were in power for that long, I think it's probably less likely to be in the democratic context that we're talking about. The US is an exception here. We think most places likely have a parliamentary system where you do have more choices, right? So for instance, in the UK, Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak, you probably have a multitude of choices there. But we told you why their side actively pushes worse policy. Their only benefit here is that now you're able to cater to minorities and trans people. But how? Do you simply solve this by implementing young people in office? We gave you structural analysis as to why it is often the people who you want to pander to, things that are electorally determinative that actually determine your platform. In fact, we actually flipped this entirely by arguing that young people are more likely to be beholden to party lines because they need to be they need favors when they are in legislation, right? You're more likely to be risk averse, to not push for very radical progressive policies in the legislature because you need to be able to suck up to your superiors, for instance. But for older politicians, let's talk about their capacity. You obviously have more leverage and power because you've been in there for a long time. But let's talk about incentive, though. We argue that you do have an incentive to push for the policies that they want on their side. Because, for instance, you have the incentives of swing voters, or people who could turn out for you, right? I.e. women, i.e. Latino voters in the US. If it is such a niche group about trans issues specifically, this is likely to be symmetric on both sides of the House. This is not in the round. What did we push under this? First, we told you that short-termist policies are less likely on our side because you have the capacity to move up the office. You're more likely to care about your CV in the long term. Second, you worsen the revolving door, and this was absolutely unresponded to because when politicians leave earlier, that is when you get more people moving into the private sector. Lastly, quickly on the principal clash. Look, our claim was that there is a very, very high bar for you to restrict democratic choice. Being literally a child is obviously a reasonable cognitive limit, but most people at 60 are still capable and can be weeded out if they are. Let's weigh this uncertainty, right? I think it is far more certain that you are cognitively less capable at 18 or 20 than you would be if you are 60. I think if this is the case, the tests are sufficient to check this. Hence, their side was insufficiently adequate to prove that there was it was a high bar enough to constrain the democratic choice, which we ought to maximize on our side of the House.
Hey. Are we good to go?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Politics is a game of influencing the middle ground of dumb voters who think you care about them. This is why instead of the hassle of catering to structural issues, We sponsor media companies that post photos of ourselves as the perfect candidate. We tell you that Ops' world of having structural reform to obtain votes happens in a tiny minority of instances with the guys that live in debater land that are able to reason everything out very well. What is the strategic flaws that come from the opposition side? One, we think the social bubble, or the version of the social bubble that they engage, is a world where older people are just generally conservative, right? They fight and say, no, some older people are liberal. We don't think we dispute that. That's not where the contention is. We said that this is about having established connections that change the values that you're going to have within that particular system. If you know that you need to cater to APEC, because these are the guys that are going to acquire the critical mass of liberal voters that don't necessarily critically evaluate the things that opposition is talking about, then they're likely going to do that rather than going through the hassle of reforming all structural issues of trans people, etc., etc., etc. They only respond to this late in 03 about having the chat of young people also having connections, but this is late one. But secondly, we say that the white rich Nepo babies who are sort of like sons of Bush are a very minuscule group of people. We don't think that they're significant enough to make that debate a debate-winning response. Secondly, on the democratic principle, let's really deconstruct this here on why this didn't work from throughout the bench. One, because they don't necessarily show us why the balance of principle doesn't extend in different outcomes, right? We ban 18-year-olds that are also very cognitively able to run a country. I think I'm, as an 18-year-old, probably very much experienced to run maybe in a space for office as a secretary or whatever. But they tell us they don't then extend to this principle and show us why that idea doesn't exist on both sides. But secondly, on sitting in political spaces generally, we showed you that democratic principle on their side is harmed because people sit in these political spaces and remain there, and that's something that is not even valuable for that access to choice in itself. Then on the quality of politics and governance, which is the primary clash here, opposition says, well, the primary incentive is to get re-elected. Okay, that's fine. They say the way you get re-elected is through representing minorities. There's the problem right here. On our side, we say it's through connections like media to influence the critical mass. On their side, they're looking for an active effort of these small people that don't access that critical mass, right? So even if they did, we say we show you already that these are small groups of people that value that, weighted against the critical mass of our side that are likely going to buy into the connections that you already have in the media spaces that you can access and that can support you. But secondly, they talk on short-term push versus the long-term lack of needs, right? For this to be a valuable impact on their side, then they had to it became contradictory with the idea that people naturally retire, right? So this is to say, what they say is that people are naturally going to retire at the age of 60, but at the same time say that people are going to try their best to have a long-term impactful term in office. We think these two contradictory principles means that they can't maximize either. We don't think they win on that. But on our side, we say the progression of politics cuts off those particular connections so that even if you don't believe in the policies that we are giving, it means that because you've got no connections but plus an increased external influence in itself, we tell you that change is likely to happen, right? We tell you change is likely to happen in that world. But secondly, we say that you're likely to be also held accountable within these systems because the critical mass will be able to notice that, hey, you know what, this person is someone who has done something wrong, and you're not being scapegoated by the idea of being old or senile. Weigh this on likelihood. On the likelihood that people will likely then hold these people accountable, and these people will likely change, as opposed to a small group of people being influenced that you're the right person for politics. We think on our side, we do a very good job in showing you why that quality of politics is something that is generally preserved. With this, never have I